So several years ago, when I served as a chaplain at a hospital, I would go to the behavioral health unit on my rounds pretty much every day. And that's a place where people who are struggling with their mental health would often come at a crisis point. And every day when I would go there, there was this nurse there at the nurse's station who would let me in. She always had a big smile, a sparkle in her eye. She knew about everyone in that unit, the nurses, the patients. She could tell you the patient's history. She could tell you what issues they were having. She could even predict when they would be released. She was amazing. As time went by, I noticed that smile that would greet me when I would come into that unit started to fade a little bit. The sparkle in her eyes started to fade just a little bit. I started to think, is it me? Does she not like me? Did I say something? Did I do something? So one day, a chaplain colleague and I were running a small grief group that we did weekly there in that unit. We would gather the patients who were there if they wanted to be part of it, and we would ask them some questions about what they were maybe struggling with in their life at that moment. Because of course, most human beings are struggling with some kind of grief almost at any given moment. And this nurse would usually sit in on these sessions. And so that day we were having this session, and my colleague asked the group to check in, and this young woman started to check in. Now I have to tell you, this patient was probably not the easiest patient that had ever come through that unit, and you could tell that in the way that she responded to the question, but she was responding from her own experience, from where she was at in that moment. And as she responded, this nurse, this wonderful, caring nurse, laughed. It wasn't an amused laugh. It was a sharp, barking, derisive laugh. Now, as you can imagine, this young woman heard this and took umbrage immediately, and so my colleague was left to deal with that while I went with this nurse out into the hallway, and then we made our way down to the break room to talk about what had happened. And she was mortified at what she had done, but she said her feelings had just so overwhelmed her in that moment. This patient had been so difficult that it just had come out. And she said that in the previous weeks, she had been feeling the burden of the work there more and more. And it had just come to this place this morning when she couldn't even control how she felt. And this is what she said then that really, I think, was the important piece. She said, I just feel everything these folks feel, and it's too much. I just feel everything these folks feel, and it's just too much. Now let me tell you about another nurse, because the ICU was also on my rounds. And it was the same story. I would go into the ICU. There was this nurse at the center of everything, the smile, the sparkling eyes. She knew everything about everyone in that place. She could tell you their story. She could tell you what they needed. She could tell you their treatment. She could tell you about their family. Just like the other nurse, she cared very, very deeply about those patients. And these are patients in a crisis point, families who are dealing with a crisis. But the thing is, as time went by, her smile did not fade. The sparkle in her eyes did not fade. And so, again, I was sitting with her one day in the break room, and I was talking about the work that she did, and the especially difficult week that she had. And she said something to me that I won't forget. She said, it's really challenging with everything that people are going through here, but I just learned to love them. Whoever they are, when they come through this unit, I just love them. So I started to think, what's the difference here? Two incredibly caring nurses, one facing being burned out and being depleted by the work, the other still challenging work, no doubt, but she's able to get through. One who feels everything her patients are feeling. The other who feels to a degree what they're feeling, but she is loving them. What's the difference? So the difference is empathy versus compassion. Two different things, actually. You can't have compassion without empathy, but compassion is something different than empathy. And we're going to talk about why it's different, how it's different. So we're going to get into the realm of neuroscience, of which I'm, of course, an expert on. But some of this work comes through my work in a doctoral program with Dr. Frank Rogers, and this is his expertise. So you get all this sort of secondhand from Frank Rogers. But he said that what happened was, several years back, neuroscientists discovered what part of the brain is activated when people are empathetic. And this was one of these things that they found in some study. I'm not sure they were even necessarily looking for it, but they found these parts of the brain that light up when people are feeling empathetic, when they're talking about things that they have empathy for. They're talking about things that, situations where they felt the pain that someone else was feeling. So they said, this is amazing. What would happen if we get somebody in who's this amazing do-gooder? You know, somebody whose entire life is set up about serving other people, doing good for other people. What's their empathy center in their brain going to look like? I mean, this must just be shooting fireworks, right? So they get this woman in, and she's talking about her work. She's talking about all of this stuff that she's done in the world. And this center of the brain is not even lining up as much as it did with just a regular person. And they're thinking, what is it with this woman? Is she a sociopath, you know? Is she doing all this stuff for the wrong reason? Why isn't this part of the brain lighting up? So what they discovered in the years since that, particularly in a study that came out in 2013, was that compassion activates a different part of the brain. And the part of the brain that empathy activates is a part of the brain that processes pain and negative emotions. And the part of the brain that compassion activates is a part that processes rewards and positive emotions. So while empathy can deplete us, compassion can restore us. Amazing, right? Two different things. But the question is, what is the difference between empathy and compassion? Why are we lighting up one part of the brain with one and not the other? Well, here's what it is. Empathy is, as we've talked about ad nauseum, it's feeling what someone else is feeling, putting yourself in their shoes. It's even feeling their pain, their sorrow, their struggle. You're actually taking that in as your own. Compassion is rooted in some empathy, but it actually has an active step beyond that. It's where we feel what someone else is feeling to a degree. We have an awareness of it, but we actually then do something in response to that. And the most basic thing you can do is have a loving regard for that person and their situation. You can love them. You can care for them. So this is, first of all, it starts as internal work that you do. So when someone is telling you about something that is just gut-wrenching, that could tear your heart out, if you position yourself, your mind and your heart, so that you are loving and caring for that person, rather than just sitting in their pain, sitting in their wound with them, you're actually activating a different part of the brain that is nourishing and replenishing and rewards you and helps you to move forward. There's a difference there, right? So why do we need this in today's world? Well, do I need to tell you? I mean, isn't this something we're all struggling with? And I have to say, I've looked at the sermons I've preached over the last several weeks now, and I'm looking ahead at the year, and I think we have a theme this year, folks. I think our theme is that it's really hard in our world right now, and that we don't just need to survive physically, emotionally, spiritually, and so on. We need to figure out how to thrive. Survival isn't enough right now. We need to learn to thrive. And so everything I think that we do this year in terms of worship, a piece of that is going to be about how you can thrive in this time. Because survival just isn't enough. We can aim for something higher than that. So this is a piece of that. So I want to tell you about what we can do specifically to use this as a process when something happens. And Frank Rogers wrote a book called The Compassion Practice, and as I said, this is his expertise. He has something that he calls the pulse practice, P-U-L-S-E, okay? And this is something that you can do when you are feeling activated or triggered or reactive to some situation that's happening, whether it's a personal situation, something you're reading about out in the world, or maybe even just sitting with someone and they're telling you about something. Because when we go into our reactive self, that's usually not our best self, right? When we're feeling, when we're feeling overwhelmed, we shut down, we might laugh like that nurse did at a completely inappropriate moment. That's not who she was at her truest self. That was her reactive, overwhelmed self acting out in that moment. So the pulse practice, the first thing we do with the P is we pay attention. When we see that something is really getting to us, we stop. We notice it within ourselves, first of all. What am I feeling? How am I responding? Do I feel like my heart is racing? Is my blood pressure up? What emotions am I feeling? We just stop and pay attention. The second thing we do with pulse is we look to understand. So if it's a situation within ourselves, we start saying, why is this particular situation getting to me in this way? What is it? What is it about this at the core that that's making me react in this way? So I can tell you a little story about using the pulse practice. When I was in my doctoral program, I got up really early. I wake up early some mornings. Lawrence hates it, but I wake up, 4:45 or something and try to go back to sleep. But I thought, oh, it's, almost 5 o'clock. I'll check my email and then go back to sleep. I've learned my lesson since then, right? So I check my email really early in the morning, and I see this subject line, and it says, concern about your coursework. And, my stomach sinks. I think, what's going on? So I open it up, and it's an email from the dean of the school, no less, and it says, there's great concern about your work in this one particular course. It's currently at C level, which is considered failing in the doctoral program. Now, intellectually, I knew that this class had only had, so far, participation points and one paper, which I had done which of course I feel compelled to tell you, I'd done very well on that paper. And so I knew that this was some kind of mistake. But did that stop me from feeling reactive in that morning? No, absolutely not. I'm reading through all of this big long email with all these concerns about this and that and different actions they might have to take and so on. So, because I was taking that class at that moment about compassion, I thought, I'm going to do this ridiculous pulse thing and just see how it goes. And so I sat there and I thought, what am I noticing in myself? And of course, I'm noticing all of those feelings. I'm noticing the anger, the humiliation bubbling up. I'm noticing, my body tensing. I feel like my neck has suddenly got a crick in it. I'm noticing all that. So then I move into the understanding piece of this. Okay, what is this about, Jason? This is a simple mistake that is probably just some clerical thing that can easily be corrected. Well, what is it about? Well, you go way back. You were always a good student. Why were you always a good student? Well, it was one thing you were good at. You know, you were no good at sports. You weren't good at a lot of other things, but you could be a really good student. And that became really important to you because adults validated you and you felt like you had a reason to exist in the world. Okay, we're getting deep at 5:58 in the morning here, right? So the next piece of this step is to try and offer love to this thing at the source of whatever it is that's causing the problem. So I'm sitting there and I'm trying to offer a sense of love for the kid who thought that he had to be a good student to have a place in the world. It's actually kind of a profound thing to do for yourself. And then I move toward the S of Pulse, which is to connect it to the sacred. Now, I know folks in this room have varying ideas about God or whether God exists or doesn't exist or whether you identify as agnostic. So I want you to understand when I talk about the sacred in this sense, it's about the universal. What is it that in this situation that's universal, that's greater than just the situation itself? So if I can kind of pull back from me in the bed, laying there next to Lawrence, you know, looking at my laptop and so on at 6 o'clock in the morning, what I see is that there's a lot of people like me that are feeling that tenderness when something is mistaken about who they are, and they have certain ideas that they feel like they needed to fulfill in the world so that they have a place in it. And suddenly my problem that morning is just a little silly little problem in the midst of everything. And I feel that connection to all of humanity and all of the universe and everything at that moment. And that sets me up for the final step, which is E, embodying a new response. And what that meant in this case is that by the time the instructor for that course sent me an apology email, I was able to write back, "No problem. I totally get it. It's fine." And I actually meant it, right? I wasn't just saying it. I meant it by that point. This is something that you can do with something that is triggering something in you, but you can also do it for someone else. And it requires a sort of creative bridge that you have to make there. Because when you get to the understanding part, let's say you're trying to understand someone who was unkind to you. You might have to fill in the gap there. You might not know for sure what the wounded place they're working from is. That's okay. This isn't a diagnosis. This is simply a way to find that sense of compassion for someone else. So you might think to yourself, well, I know they had a childhood where they moved around a lot. You know, maybe they struggle to maintain long-term relationships, and I can understand that difficulty. And that may be what I'm seeing in this moment. So we often have clues into why someone behaves in a way that makes us reactive, and we can use that way of understanding. Again, even if we're not exactly sure that that's the root of it, we can use that so that we can move into a place of compassion and understanding. I think in our world today, it is really necessary to be able to understand the difference in these practices. And another way to think about it, because I know compassion and empathy seem so close, but if you've ever had to do something, maybe you have a surly relative you've had to do some things for, you know, and doing it from a place of duty and washing their dishes feels very different than washing the dishes of someone that you are connected to and feeling loving toward. So the reality is we already understand this, that the place that we do something from is important in terms of how it feels as we're doing it. So the loving regard is part of compassion because that is an active step that we're doing. But even more than that, compassion compels us to do something, not just sit with a loving regard. Because if we have a loving regard, we suddenly feel a certain energy, like, I actually could help. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could start a letter writing campaign. Maybe I could actually get out in the world and help the situation. But if we're just too empathetic, We just sit there in the wound with that person and we feel like there's no options. So that's the big difference. Thinking about this woman, Angie Rodriguez. She was an asylum seeker from Colombia, and she went to her first courthouse appointment. And when she got there, she was given another date to come back. And as she was leaving, ICE snatched her, as they've been doing. And they took her to one of those detention centers. And in so doing, eventually she realized that she was pregnant. And she ended up having a miscarriage because the conditions were so deplorable there. Now, that's a situation when we hear about it, we can empathize and we can really feel the pain and struggle she's going through. But the important thing to know is there were people who did empathize, but then they also took that compassionate lens and they started to share her story. There was a senator who did a whole report on how conditions in these detention centers are affecting pregnant women. You had different immigrants, coalitions and support groups that are out there trying to tackle this situation. So we see compassion is actually active. Empathy might be a starting point, but when we are compassionate, we are moving toward doing something in response. And I know that you understand why this matters so much now, because I know we're all struggling to figure out how do we not stay immobilized. You know, how do we, my friend now, Maximilian Alvarez from the Real News Network, just did this wonderful documentary on the children of Gaza. And I saw that and I thought, I don't know that I can watch that. And then I immediately thought about what I was going to preach this Sunday. And I thought, oh yeah, remind myself, I have the tools to be able to watch this. We know how to do this when we're intentional about it so that we can take in what is important that we take in our world today, but not become so overwhelmed that we're not able to function in the middle of all this. So that is our call this morning. Our call is to feel the pulse of our own hearts, to feel the sorrow and suffering, but also the potential and possibility and hope that is all part of the human condition. Our call this morning is to feel the pulse of love. Love that invites us out of that place of anxiety and reactivity and fear and into a place of courage, into a place that sets us up to be able to take action. And our call this morning is to feel the pulse of compassion itself, the rhythm that binds all things, that heartbeat that connects us all to each other, that heartbeat of love at the center of our faith. And I really think that if we listen, we can hear that heartbeat. We can hear that heartbeat and know that we are indeed part of that collective beating. And that when we choose compassion, we make that heartbeat strong.